Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Saideman on intervention. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Senior Fellow here at CG. And it's my pleasure to welcome a guest into the studios here at the Center for International Governance Innovation every week to talk about some pressing issue on the international agenda. And today we have not only a pressing issue on the agenda, but a recurring issue on the agenda. Sure. And it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Stephen Saideman from the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, where he is the Paterson Chair in International Affairs. So welcome to CG.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And maybe you can start by telling us a bit about why you're visiting us at CG.
Each year there's a book put out called Canada Among Nations, and it's the last few years it's been a partnership between NIPSIA, the school at Carleton, and CG. And this year's theme is intervention, and the idea is to try to learn from Canada's involvement in a variety of places over the past 15 or 20 years. It's not just Afghanistan focused, but sort of Afghanistan's a significant part of it. But the idea is that we really need to learn why we do these things, how we do these things, what went well, what went poorly, so that way when we do the next one, we can do it better. One of the ironies or paradoxes, I guess is a better word, is that the Canadian government tried to do a lessons learned exercise in the aftermath of Afghanistan. And of course, whenever you do a lessons learned exercise, you reveal things that went well and when things went poorly, and that's inconvenient for politicians, so they bury the document. And the problem is step 2 of a lessons learned exercise is actually to share the lesson. So right. We figure this volume is a way to do the work that the government can't do.
Right. Who did the lessons learned exercise?
It was supposed to be PCO.
Privy Council Office.
Yes.
And do we know anything at all about the conclusions? Have they leaked?
No, they have not leaked. In fact, the problem is not only can academics like us not get it, but the people who are in government who should have access to it can't get it. So I have filed an access and information request, and it got rejected utterly. So I'm now in the appeal process, and that takes oodles of time.
Right. But there have been a lot of outside observers of what was happening in Afghanistan all along. So the academic community certainly has its own sense of what went right and what went wrong. What would you say were some of the things that went right and some of the things that went wrong?
Okay. Well, I've been working on this because I've got a book project of my own on this. And I think some of the things that went well is that the reason why Canada was there was to support its allies. It was not really intrinsically interested in Afghanistan. And so Canada really gave a lot of support, not just to the Americans by being in Afghanistan, but by being more flexible than a lot of the allies. And so they were willing to go to the British sector and help out the British. They were willing to go to the Dutch sector and help out the Dutch. And so they really, in terms of job one of being a flexible military force to help out the neighborhood, our friends in the neighborhood, that worked out really well. And it gave Canada influence over how NATO was doing things. In a lot of other NATO missions, Canada might be at the kids' table or not even in the room, like when they were doing stuff in the Balkans. Most of the decision making was made by the 5 biggest force contributors, which would be the British, the Americans, the Italians, the Germans, and the French. And I arranged one of those dinners when I had a fellowship in Washington, and there were no Canadians to be seen. Whereas in Afghanistan, they had influence over how things were being done.
Right, and there was a reason why Canada played that role you just described, and Canada was well received, in my understanding, by the other members of the NATO forces that were in Afghanistan. What was it in particular about Canada that people appreciated? What did the Canadians do well?
What they did well was, they operated in Kandahar. They were willing to serve in the southern part of Afghanistan, which was one of the most violent parts. And some of the more powerful NATO countries, such as the Germans and the Italians, refused to serve in the more dangerous places, and they also have a variety of restrictions on what they could and couldn't do. Whereas the Canadians, from 2005 onwards, were not only in a dangerous place, but had rules that allowed them to show up when they needed to. And so while there were too few to actually do the job that they were supposed to do, which was counterinsurgency campaign in Kandahar, they were able to sort of hold the fort, hold Kandahar when it was contested. And that made a big impression on everybody else. And they also had, within the entire NATO structure, personnel that were playing pivotal roles, which meant that when Libya happened, people were very comfortable at having Lieutenant General Bouchard be the head of the operation because they're used to having Canadians in significant positions of command within the NATO structures.
And Canada used to have a very active, long history of doing peacekeeping missions, a slightly different thing. Did that carry over into a skill set that was useful in counterinsurgency and so-called peace building in Afghanistan, or was that a very different kind of task?
I think there's probably some overlapping expertise that Canada, I think, was more comfortable in sort of the softer ways in which the military could act on the ground as compared to the Americans, who had been doing very, very physical, kinetic fighting in Iraq. So when the Canadians came into Afghanistan, they were already more disposed to buying into the counterinsurgency doctrine of being more restrained in the use of force. There were tales being told of the Canadians being willing to sort of trip ambushes in front of the Americans because the Canadians wouldn't overuse the use of force and destroy all the credit that they had built up, whereas the Americans might just level the entire area. Now that might be an exaggeration, but the general idea is that Canada was more comfortable at the sort of more engagement parts of what the military was trying to do on the ground as opposed to just combat.
And what's your sense of some things that didn't go well?
Well, the first thing is that Canada had too few forces on the ground. And so that meant that for most of the time there, they were doing what they called mowing the lawn or acting as a fire brigade, where they would go out and fight the Taliban and defeat them in particular spots. But the mantra of counterinsurgency was clear, hold, and build, which is you clear territory of the opponents, then you hold it while they build, do the governance, the development, try to build confidence in the Afghan government and also the NATO forces. But they never had enough people to stand still until when Obama had his surge. Then suddenly there were all these Americans in Kandahar, then the Canadians could concentrate. And so one of the papers in our edited volume will be on the village program, the model village program that John Vance developed, where in the Dan district they focused a lot of effort on one spot. And they were able to do clear and hold and build.
And is there any sort of practical implication that you draw from the Afghanistan experience for what Canada is doing right now in Iraq and Syria?
I think the practical application is not to do this again.
Not to do Afghanistan.
Not to put 3,000 guys on the ground, expending billions of dollars, exposing politicians back home to all kinds of possible news stories. So I think the lesson was learned by the Harper government, certainly not to put anybody on the ground anytime too soon. Great.
We'll be back again in a minute with Stephen Saideman. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back. So don't do it again. Seems like a very easy sell politically,
Sure.
and yet we are doing it again. We're just not doing boots on the ground again.
Right.
What's your understanding of the politics behind Canada agreeing to participate in an air support capacity in the battle against the Islamic State or ISIS or ISIL or whatever you prefer to call it?
Yeah, I feel sorry for all the girls named ISIS. And we've had a bunch of international organizations or think tanks having to worry about their names. I think that the real challenge right now is it's a long extended operation. It's not going to be 6 months. And so the Harper government's trying to sell this thing as a 6-month thing, but it's clearly not going to take just 6 months. So that it creates a credibility problem, which is one of the things that the Harper government is very good at creating for itself, of saying, well, we're going to be in Mali for a week, then it becomes 2 weeks, then it becomes a month. But the politics behind it, I think, are mostly about, again, Canada trying to be part of an alliance. Now, this is not a NATO operation, but it's very NATO-ish because it's got a lot of the same partners. I like to think of it as being Libya Redux, because in Libya we tried to engage regime change. We didn't call it that, but the idea was we try to use air power, no boots on the ground, in support of a local ally to get an outcome. And the outcome we got was the one we wanted, which was get rid of Gaddafi. We didn't commit to the aftermath. In this case, we're trying to provide air support to the Kurds and to the Iraqi government to deal with ISIL in Iraq. Part of this means then that there's probably more American planes freed up to then engage in their effort in Syria. So I think that's the idea. And I think Harper has a sincere interest in doing this kind of thing because he's voiced a lot of opposition to this sort of thing. But it's also a traditional Canadian thing, which is when the allies are called to do something, Canada shows up.
And one of the problems with Afghanistan, the critics latched onto, was mission creep. That we went into Afghanistan to do one thing, which was root out al-Qaeda, and then it morphed into another thing and a much more ambitious thing, which was to build a stable, so-called democratic, united Afghanistan. Mission creep is a phrase we already hear thrown around with respect to the Islamic State operation, but it's hard to know what to make of it because there hasn't been a clear articulation of what the original mission is. People aren't using phrases like responsibility to protect. They aren't using things like state building. What is the mission in your view at the moment, and where might it creep to?
I think the mission itself is right now an air campaign to be the air support for the various actors on the ground that we are supporting. I think it's mostly to give the Kurds a chance to survive and to keep their territory and push back. And I think it's an effort to provide the Iraqi government with some breathing room so that way they can get their act together, because the United States spent a tremendous amount of money and effort to try to build an Iraqi army that's collapsed. But there's still kernels of things there to build upon to try to bring the Iraqi government army back, and to maybe have the Iraqi government make a deal with the Sunnis so that way the ISIL loses its support in most of Iraq. It's strong in the Sunni areas, and in the Anbar awakening where the American surge was really played out was when the Americans sent a lot of troops, and it was not just that they sent a lot of troops, and it was also that the Sunnis there turned against the more extremist forces and supported the Americans, and that made a big contribution to damping down the violence. The Shia government broke the deals with the Sunnis, and so that ended that progress, and the Sunnis went back to supporting extremists. I am reluctant to think about this, the term mission creep. In fact, I've been joking that actually I'm not joking, I'm going to do it. I'm going to dress up as mission creep for Halloween because I think it's a scare thing. It's like mission creep, woo! And for Canada, I don't think mission creep is a threat. I think extending the mission beyond 6 months and doing the same thing that, for another 6 months is not mission creep. You're not changing what you're doing.
Right.
You're just doing it for longer. Will this mean inevitably that Canadians will be on the ground fighting? No, because there has to be a decision of radically changing the mission. And in Afghanistan, that happened. It wasn't that we're doing one thing in Kabul and suddenly we find ourselves in Kandahar and ooh, wow, what's going on here? It was the government made a discrete decision, weighed the risks, and it was a very serious decision. The other countries involved were making the serious decision. They could have opted out. Some essentially did, or did much less. And in this case, Canada would have to decide, okay, we are now going to put boots on the ground. We actually have to put combat forces in play. And there's no logic for that to happen. Okay, there might be a need for this to happen, but the Canadian politics are such that Harper would have to give up his goal of balancing the budget because it would cost a lot of money. And that's his most important priority for the election next year. And he'd have to give up control of the messaging because you have 2,000, 3,000 young men and women on the field, then you can't tell them what to say. And that's really the second highest priority for this government is making sure that nobody can say anything that's not within their messaging. And so I don't think that they're going to make that kind of decision.
You're talking about lots of boots on the ground, but what about special forces?
They're already there.
Right.
Yeah, and
they're politically not an issue in your mind.
Well, one of the differences between Canada and the United States, and pretty much between the British-style systems and the United States, is there's a lot more deference by the media and by the public about not asking questions about special forces. So we never know what JTF-2 is doing. We never know where they are. Whereas in the United States, the Delta guys come, or not the Delta guys so much, but the SEALs come back, they appear on TV, they write books. The American media and the Congress have a lot more inquisitiveness about what the special forces are doing, so we find out about it. But the political ramifications for special forces in Canada are minimal because we can't find out about it. And the members of parliament don't have the power to ask about it because they don't have security clearances. So whatever they're doing, we don't know about it, so there's a lot less political ramifications.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. We'll be back again in a minute with Stephen Saideman. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Well, Steve, you described the mission in Iraq and Syria as helping the forces on the ground that we like. Mm-hmm. Who are they? Are we sure we like them? Should we like them?
Yes.
And if it is a NATO-ish mission, where's Turkey?
These are all good questions. And I think the first thing is that I've been taking a call in the Middle East, the land of lousy policy alternatives. The one reason why countries are more willing to be involved with Iraq than Syria is there are actors in Iraq that are less problematic. So the Kurds have done a very good job over the past 10 years, ever since the invasion of Iraq, to pose themselves as being a democratic, stable force. They might not be as democratic or as stable as they advertise, but they seem to be more functional than pretty much every other actor in Iraq or even in Syria. And so they seem to be somebody we can bet on. Now, this raises the problem of Turkey because Turkey has its own Kurdish population, and so they see the rise of a potentially independent Kurdish state in what used to be Iraq to be a possible magnet for a larger irredentism project, which is to have all the different Kurdish pieces in Iran, in Syria, in Turkey form a new country of Kurdistan. They're very concerned about that. So the Turks, who've been loath to use violence in places like Afghanistan as part of the NATO mission, have always been very willing to use violence against their own Kurdish population. So that's led them to be very, very conflicted over what's been going on with Kobani, which is this Kurdish town just on the other side of the border in Syria, where everybody's been wanting to get the Turks to get involved, and they're like, well, if we support them, then we may be supporting folks who are allied with people who want to separate from us. And so they've been contesting that.
Although Erdogan had been engaging with the PKK, and there was a de facto ceasefire in Turkey, and there were dialogues, and increasingly cooperation between the Kurds in northern Iraq and Turkey. I mean, the Kurds in northern Iraq were using Turkey as their outlet for oil exports most of the time. So there was a modus vivendi that was actually working pretty well, and all of a sudden, that seems to have fallen apart.
Yes, and I don't really know why it fell apart. I mean, the other complication from this is that Turkey doesn't view ISIS as the biggest threat, but views Assad as the biggest threat. And so they're trying to leverage getting outsiders to give more support for the war against Assad in exchange for Turkey's support for the war against ISIS. And that puts a lot of people in difficult positions because the United States, for instance, is flying over Syria, dropping bombs on ISIS or ISIL, with sort of the implicit cooperation of Assad, that the United States hasn't had to go through the effort of destroying all of Syria's air defenses because Assad's keeping them turned off. So the United States doesn't want to be fighting a two-front war in Syria. Turkey has borne some casualties from the Syrian civil war spilling over onto their territory, much more enthusiastic about getting rid of Assad than dealing with ISIL. So it's such a complex situation for the Turks, and it's easy for us to demand more of them. But they're right there, and we can talk about this being a threat to Canada or being a threat to the United States. It's not as much of a threat to us as it is to the Turks. So the fact that they are feeling cross pressures on this, we have to have a little bit of sympathy for it, even if they've misplayed it by allowing their border to be a conduit for ISIL.
And does Canada have a horse in this race at all, or not?
I think Canada has actually got a really strange position on this, a unique position on this, because in the air campaign, all the European countries are willing to drop bombs in Iraq. The Arab countries are participating in the airstrikes in Syria. Canada is the only country to say, well, we could do Syria if we were invited in. And that's recognizing that since there's no UN resolution, the only way for this to be legitimate is to be invited by the country. But since Assad's no longer seen as a legitimate actor, how do you get invited by it?
Right.
So that's very complex. But in terms of the local actors on the ground, we'd like to have the Free Syria Army be competent and be able to support them. But the United States is at least worried about if you arm those folks, do the arms just show up in ISIL hands? That's kind of what happened in Iraq. So it's a very difficult situation for Canada as well in Syria. So I think that's another reason why a lot of countries are just dodging the Syrian question, because as hard as Iraq is, Syria is much more complex.
Mm-hmm. Now in Parliament, there was a certain amount of debate and discussion and excitement, and the key players were the ones you'd predict. Mr. Mulcair and Justin Trudeau, and surprisingly little uptake, I thought, in the public and among the media. It didn't seem to be an issue that engaged much. What's your read on that? Or maybe you have a different read.
I don't know. I mean, my self-centered viewpoint is I was asked to talk a lot about it for the month, so I thought there was a lot of media coverage. On the other hand, I think one of the challenges is that when you have one of these votes, it seems like the issue is settled for a while, and so the media goes away. I get less invitations, you get less invitations, and the public doesn't think about it that much more. It's handled, and because there's no fire here in Ottawa, the media goes away. And we saw that in Afghanistan too, that the coverage is episodic depending on the debates in Ottawa.
But no real outcry.
No real outcry, and I think that's because we had a conversation yesterday about this at our conference, which is that when people might be opposed but they're kind of confused, if you're confused about something, that's less likely to get you out of the streets, with protest signs. And just as Afghanistan was inherently confusing, it was a difficult situation. It's kind of hard to have the right message, that fits onto a placard and shouting out loud, compared to, let's say, no new tuition increases. You could put that on a placard very easily, as we found out when I was living in Montreal a couple years ago. For Syria, for ISIL, we're seeing such brutality, such barbarism on the part of ISIL, what they're doing to the media who show up there, to the women and to the ethnic groups that are there. It's kind of hard to be, saying, no, they deserve a chance, or no, we shouldn't do something. It's just that what we can do, what is likely to be effective, it's all uncertain. So those uncertainties kind of make it hard for people to get out and go, this is awful, we got to protest. And that leads to politicians having these very mixed messages. I mean, Justin Trudeau has had a difficult spot because he has to navigate between the left of the NDP and the right of the Conservatives. And I think that the strategy is that the votes for the next election are in Quebec and trying to take them away from the NDP more so than trying to take them away from Conservatives. So he's trying to be just like the NDP, but a little bit distinct in order to make him look like the Liberals are different, like an alternative. And so their non-combat option was like, why non-combat? What's the importance of non-combat? It's not like the Liberals are a pacifist party. They've sent Canadian forces into harm's way on numerous occasions, including Kandahar. So I think that dynamic put the Liberals in a difficult spot, and I don't think they handled it particularly well. But it allowed them to move on, or the people to move on, and look to the next issue because it's at least settled for now for at least 6 months.
Very good. We'll be back one last time with Stephen Saideman. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So, Steve, I understand you're working on a new book project. What's the follow-on project?
Well, I had so much fun researching NATO and Afghanistan. I learned a lot about how different democracies run their militaries. That, for instance, in Afghanistan, every country had different rules for what was going on based on their own domestic political situations. Mm-hmm. But it raised lots of questions. So I was talking to a member of the Canadian Parliament about what they knew about what was going on, and they basically confessed ignorance because they were not allowed to ask the tough questions because Canadian members of Parliament don't have security clearances, not even the people on the Defense Committee. And so this is a real problem for democratic control of the military, in my view, because you have to trust the executive branch to do what's right and with complete blindness. And as someone who was raised in the United States, I was very used to having the congressional committees, the Senate and House Armed Services Committee, be able to hold meetings behind closed doors with a staff that has information, classified information, so that way they can then ask the generals the tough questions, and the generals have to answer. And so that anticipation that you may end up being called in front of Congress is a critical constraint on the military and on the government, because then the government can't do things behind closed doors. And so the reality is that the world's democracies vary in what role the legislatures play. I would say that Canada's parliament is on the extreme end of the relevant versus irrelevant spectrum, being very irrelevant for most things when it comes to the Canadian military, except for maybe procurement.
Is that just because the Westminster model are they all on the same end as Canada? Or?
Well, the project wants to compare the Westminster countries to each other. I actually had an interview with Paul Martin at one point. He said, don't compare us to the United States, compare us to the British and the Australians. And I was like, that's a great travel plan.
Right.
And so we want to compare that category of countries to the presidential systems, to the European-style parliaments, because it's not a parliamentarism thing versus a presidential thing, because the parliaments of Europe do have defense committees that have security clearances that are allowed to ask the tough questions, and they do hold their defense ministers and their military's feet to the fire, essentially. So it's not really between presidencies and parliamentary systems. It is a bit between Westminster systems and everybody else, but what's interesting is that the British have taken a serious look at revising things because they understand there's a gap here. And the Australians have a Senate that's more empowered than the Canadian Senate, so they do things a little bit differently. So the project, which I have a couple co-authors, Phil Lagasse at the University of Ottawa, Dave Arswald at the U.S. National War College, what we want to do is compare a bunch of the world's democracies and see why things vary amongst the Westminster systems, to see why Canada is so much at the one end of the spectrum. And it might be just because Canada is also at the very, very far end of the party discipline spectrum. So if you think about countries that have party discipline, Canada is at one end of the spectrum because the backbenchers have very little freedom. They can't even write their own questions for question period. And so that way you can't have people in the majority party really ask pesky questions in committees at all. Whereas the United States traditionally had been at the other end of that spectrum of having no party discipline, and so you'd often have Democratic senators making names for themselves by holding Democratic presidents accountable.
Right.
And the same thing for the Republicans. Now, because the system is polarized, we can look now at how the quality of oversight in the United States has changed, because now you have such a strong difference between the two parties. You're not going to see, you're going to see McCain beat up on the Democrats, but you're not going to see McCain beat up on the Republicans so much, even though he's a maverick. I mean, there was a little bit of that, but not too much. So we want to look at Latin American countries to see how those newer democracies deal with these kinds of problems. We want to take a look at East Asian countries, because the NATO book completely ignored large swaths of the world. So we want to look at how Japan and South Korea do this. So I'm currently in the middle of trying to raise money to do the research, because we have people doing research in all these different places, but haven't thought about the larger comparisons about how do legislatures play a role in overseeing or holding the military to account.
It's interesting. There might be some advantage to being at the Canadian extreme, which would be low risk of politicization of military operations. Don't you think?
Well, this is one of the things we want to understand is okay, the military isn't politicized, which is a good thing. So we want to look at the European examples and also the British and Australian examples to see what happens when the parliament gets a little bit more involved. Does the military become a political actor? So that would be good. But on the other hand, one of the challenges in Canada is you have to, because the members of parliament can't ask classified questions in question period, because they don't know what to ask, how do they hold the minister to account for the actions of the military? And the answer is they can't really, because they either don't know, because they don't have the information, or they can't ask because most of their mechanisms for doing this are public. And so we saw a big fiasco over the course of 2 or 3 years in the Afghanistan operation over the detainee file, because the military said this stuff is classified. And so it took, 2 years for them to get to a process where a couple of members of parliament could go to a room, look at the documents, not take notes, not do, but just identify which documents might be declassifiable. And it utterly delayed the possibility. And the reality was that Canada was doing the best it could in a difficult circumstance. And there was a lot of smoke, but no fire. But it allowed the government itself to also sort of delay. Whereas if, in my mind, maybe it wouldn't happen this way, but in my mind, if you actually had a defense committee that was empowered to look at the classified documents, they would have looked at the situation and gone, well, there's not a whole lot of fire here. Maybe we can ask tougher questions about the actual mission as opposed to this side, It was important, but it was not the essential nugget of the mission. There were more important questions to be asked. And they didn't ask them because they got distracted by this thing that they really didn't know anything about.
And is it your sense that these different approaches to oversight in various democracies really complicated coordination and cooperation among NATO troops in Afghanistan, or did they all have their own isolated missions that they all did in their own particular way and this didn't become a big issue?
Well, it was a big issue, but it was not through this process. My book that came out last spring was NATO and Afghanistan, Fighting Together, Fighting Alone. So everybody was fighting their own wars, how to combine those little wars amongst the country. That was complicated by not so much legislative oversight, that is, the legislators asking tough questions. It was impacted more by legislatures or cabinets making deals about how to send the troops there. And so if you have to have the left wing and right wing party make a deal about how to send them, then the less enthusiastic party is going to say, we need to have these rules that will limit our risks. And those turned into these caveats that meant the Germans couldn't leave the north, the Italians couldn't leave the west, some troops couldn't fight at night, some troops couldn't fight in the south or have offensive operations. So I think the previous book was more about the executive dynamics. This is more about the legislative dynamics.
Well, fascinating. We'll be very interested to learn what you find and its implications, not only for Canada, but for cooperation with other countries. And thanks to our audience for joining us again this week for my conversation with Stephen Saideman, who, by the way, has one of the more interesting Twitter feeds, I think, of the international politics people. So if you're interested in following Stephen, you can find him at SM Saideman. And please come back again. Looking forward to the next opportunity to chat. And to our audience, I hope you join us next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.
the neighborhood, our friends in the neighborhood. That worked out really well, and it gave Canada influence over how NATO was doing things. In a lot of other NATO missions, Canada might be at the kids' table or not even in the room, like in when they were doing stuff in the Balkans. Most of the decision making was made by the 5 biggest force contributors, which would be the British, the the Americans, the Italians, the Germans, and the French. And I arranged one of those dinners when I had a fellowship in Washington, and there were no Canadians to be seen. Whereas in Afghanistan, they had influence over how things were being done.
Right, and there was a reason why Canada played that role you just described, and Canada was well received, in my understanding, by the other members of the NATO forces that were in Afghanistan. What was it in particular about Canada that people appreciated? What did the Canadians do well?
What they did well was, A, they operated in Kandahar. They were willing to
Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Saideman on intervention. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Bosch School of International Affairs and Senior Fellow here at CG. And it's my pleasure to welcome a guest into the studios here at the Center for International Governance Innovation every week to talk about some pressing issue on the international agenda.
And it got rejected utterly, so I'm now in the appeal process, and that takes oodles of time.
Right, but there have been a lot of outside observers of what was happening in Afghanistan all along, so the academic community certainly has its own sense of what went right and what went wrong. What would you say were some of the things that went right and some of the things that went wrong?
Okay, well, I've been working on this because I've got a book project of my own on this, and I think some of the things that went well is that the reason why Canada was there was to support its allies. It was not really intrinsically interested in Afghanistan. And so Canada really gave a lot of support, not just to the Americans by being in Afghanistan, but by being more flexible than a lot of the allies. And so they were willing to go to the British sector and help out the British. They were willing to go to the Dutch sector and help out the Dutch. And so they really, in terms of job one of being a flexible military force to help out.
And today we have not only a pressing issue on the agenda, but a recurring issue on the agenda.
Sure.
And it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Saideman from the Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, where he is the Paterson Chair in International Affairs. So welcome to CG.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And maybe you can start by telling us a bit about why you're visiting us at CG.
Each year there's a book put out called Canada Among Nations, and it's the last few years it's been a partnership between NIPSIA, the school at Carleton, and CG. And this year's theme is intervention, and the idea is to try to learn from Canada's involvement in a variety of places over the past 15 or 20 years. It's not just Afghanistan focused, but sort of Afghanistan's a significant part of it. But the idea is that we really need to learn why we do these things, how we do these things, what went well, what went poorly, so that way when we do the next one, we can do it better. One of the ironies or paradoxes, I guess is a better word, is that the Canadian government tried to do a lessons learned exercise in the aftermath of Afghanistan. And of course, whenever you do a lessons learned exercise, you reveal things that went well and when things went poorly, and that's inconvenient for politicians, so they bury the document. And the problem is step 2 of a lessons learned exercise is actually to share the lesson. So
Right.
we figure this volume is a way to do the work that the government can't do.
Right. Who did the lessons learned exercise?
It was supposed to be PCO.
Privy Council Office.
Yes.
And do we know anything at all about the conclusions? Have they leaked?
No, they have not leaked. In fact, the problem is not only can academics like us not get it, but the people who are in government who should have access to it can't get it. So I have filed an access and information request